Well, it's a little after 10, so I will go ahead and call the meeting to order. And we'll let Jim give the minutes of the last meeting, please.
Hi, everyone. President Jack Baker called the Goingsnake District Heritage Association meeting to order at 10:08 a.m. with 21 members and guests present virtually. 39 people have viewed the YouTube video. Secretary Jim Terry read the minutes of the March 20th meeting, and they were approved as read. Treasurer Ruth Faulkner's financial report was read by Jim Terry. Total monies as of April 17th, 2021 is $14,468.47. The report was approved as given. Maribel Chase gave her Cherokee Moment presentation, reading from letters in the National Archives to the Cherokee Agency from 1830 to 1831 regarding the gold mines in Georgia. In old business, Luke Williams told us all the purchases of new equipment have been made with the Oklahoma Historical Society grant money. Our featured speaker was Charlie Rodemar, director of the Sequoia Birthplace Museum. Charlie gave us a virtual walking tour of the museum, telling stories about the life of Sequoia, the creation of the Cherokee syllabary, and a demonstration of the Acorn printing press. Jack Baker adjourned the meeting at 11:48 a.m.
Thanks, Jim. Are there any additions or corrections? And a motion for their approval.
I move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 I could say or a thumbs up, but any opposed? Minutes are approved. David, do you want to give Bruce's report? Or will it?
I have it here. Checking balance as of April 17th was $5,801. Income from dues, $176. Total checking now is $5,977. There were no paid outs. The CD balance beginning $8,668. Interest earned was $2. Ending balance $8,670. Total of all monies as of today $14,647.
Is there any question or discussion on the treasurer's report? Looks like we're gradually building back up. So if not, it'll stand approved as given. And next we'll have Mary Bell's Cherokee Moments.
My Cherokee Moments for this morning, and please, this terminology, I just hate to read the correct terminology, but that was the way it was back then. And of course, today, it wouldn't be even considered. But my Cherokee Moments for this morning, and incidentally, this is something that I had given to the Goingsnake group several years ago. And as I mentioned to you several months ago, that I might be repeating some of my Cherokee Moments because not everyone either attended the meeting or had access to any of our programs. So occasionally I'll mention it again. I will be giving certain items ever so often, not all the time, but occasionally. But anyway, the title of my presentation is Cherokee Asylum for the Insane, Deaf, Dumb, and Blind. My Cherokee Moments previous to this one several years ago was the Cherokee Orphan Asylum at Salina. But I want to stress the example of the Cherokee Nation being responsible in a compassionate way for less fortunate citizens. And at that time, I informed the participants to the meeting that the National Council passed an act in 1866 to establish the Cherokee Orphan Asylum. At the same time, a site about 6 miles south of Tahlequah was selected for the home for the insane, blind, deaf, and dumb, and also the indigent was included. On October the 31st, 1873, an act was passed by the National Council authorizing the establishment of a home for these unfortunate people. A committee consisting of D.W. Bushyhead, who was National Treasurer at that time and later would become Principal Chief, S.S. Stevens, Superintendent of Public Instruction, together with the Board of Trustees of the Orphan Asylum, met in December 1873 to select the permanent sites for the two institutions which were to be established as soon as possible. The following news item appeared in the Cherokee Advocate, December the 20th, 1873, and I quote, "The board for permanently locating the orphan asylum and also the home for the insane, blind, and so forth, created by an act of the last council, have, we believe, performed this duty by locating the orphan asylum at the old Lewis Ross place." And of course, you know that Lewis Ross was a brother to Principal Chief John Ross. And this was generally known as the Grand Saline. And of course, this is present day Salina, Oklahoma. About 40 miles from Tahlequah on the Grand River, for which place or improvement they pay $28,000, and also by locating the home for the insane and so forth on the improvement of Lewis Ross Jr. about 6 miles from Tahlequah, for which they pay $1,200. Thus, the much vexed matter is settled beyond appeal. The Board of Trustees were Principal Chief Charles Thompson, Assistant Principal Chief David Rowe, Stephen Foreman, Levi Keys, and Wilson Sanders. The asylum for the insane and so forth was opened on March the 1st, 1877, with the following: general debility, 1 person; rheumatism, 2 persons; blind, 11 persons; cripples, 4 persons. And I just hate to say this: insane or idiots, 3; consumption, 1 person. There were various stewards who overlooked the operation of the home who were appointed over the years. Other duties of the steward were to appoint a physician to care for the inmates whenever needed, and also a minister of the gospel to conduct church services on Sundays. The following article concerning the Cherokee Asylum for the Insane and so forth appeared in the Cherokee Advocate, October the 12th, 1887. No one who has seen this institution but will agree that it is by far the most beautiful of our public institutions. It is located about 6 miles south of Tahlequah, to the extreme west terminus of the range of mountains known as the Park Hill Range of Mountains. At present, it is under the care of Mr. Robert Wofford as steward. Mr. Wofford has done a good work for the nation in his management of this institution. There has been some repairing to this asylum during the past year. The 3 rooms of its basement and 2 of its hallways should be refloored. The building is always kept clean and nice, having, like the other public institutions, regular intervals for washing and scouring. The enclosure is always clean and free from trash and debris. Is set with beautiful shade trees, regularly trimmed and kept. The yard is large and laid out in walks with choice flowers bordering and fringing the sidewalk. The fencing around the enclosure is new and substantial. There are now belonging to the institution 18 inmates, 8 males and 10 females. We would suggest that the steward be allowed an extra hand about the place as a sick nurse. There are 3 or 4 of these inmates who require constant care of a good, strong, able-bodied nurse, one that is able to manage these persons. And also, there were reports that were made, and I'm not sure who the reports were made to, whether they were made to the committee or exactly who, but in one of the reports, there's mention that crops were grown at the home, and at one time there were 46 hogs and 26 head of cattle, and they also had some mules, so that this activity would help to sustain the inmates and workers at the home. On November the 16th, 1907, Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory became the state of Oklahoma. On May the 22nd, 1908, 10 patients from Cherokee County arrived at Norman, Oklahoma to be placed in the institution there. And this represented the last of the people that the Cherokee Nation had so valiantly assisted through trial and misfortune. And this concludes my Cherokee moments for this morning.
Thanks, Mary Bell. It was very good. I think towards the end, it had become almost like our present nursing homes. It was caring for the ones that couldn't really help themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in the 1890s, there were accounts of people getting injured so that they were paralyzed and they were taken there to be cared for.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or discussions of Mary Bell? No, we appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any new business or old business to cover? Or any new business? Okay. Well, I'm not really going to talk about the Tulsa race riot that much, other than particularly for those that are away from Oklahoma. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. I'll just say a few words about it. If you live in Oklahoma, we've heard quite a bit about it because the 100th anniversary is coming up on actually May 31st and June 1st. And I know that Luke has spent a lot of time on this, I'm sure, at the Tulsa Historical Society on this. But basically briefly on May 31st of 1921, there's a shoeshine boy in one of the hotels, got on the elevator who was operated by a white girl, and she shrieked or screamed, and some people say that he supposedly accidentally stepped on her foot when he got on the elevator. But anyway, it was a white girl screaming and a young black man. So the black man wound up being arrested, and there were charges that he was trying to rape her and all that, which was very much in the open. So that's was not the case. But nevertheless, he was arrested. And then there was a lynch mob formed that evening around the Tulsa jail wanting to lynch him. And by the way, just a month before, a white boy had been lynched, taken out of the jail and lynched in Tulsa. And so at that point, there was, of course, was strict segregation, and the blacks lived in the Greenwood district, which was north of Archer Street and just north of the railroad tracks that ran just north of present downtown Tulsa. So the blacks had a very thriving business area, and it was called the Black Wall Street. But that night, and so some of their men went to offer their assistance to the sheriff to prevent the riot. And they did, I think they made a couple of trips offering to. And at one point, they got into it with some of the lynch mob, and then it turned into the riot. And like early the morning of June 1st, I believe there were 35 blocks of the Black Wall Street, the business area, was burned, including many, many homes. And there's may have been up to 300 of the blacks killed during this period. And there were also several white people killed, which is not talked about that much because they had their guns trying to shoot and kill some of the black men who were, I believe it was in the school basement or one of the church basements, I've forgotten which. And so they fired back and killed several of the white men too. But nevertheless, it was one of the largest and was disastrous riots in the country. So that's a little bit of the background of it. So Gilcrease Museum has a large grant to work on this one, Eddie Faye Gates collection of primarily interviews that she did in the 1990s and the early 2000s of race riot survivors. And then also in the 90s, she was doing a oral history of North Tulsa. So there's a huge amount in her collection, photographs, but the oral interviews. So the grant is to put all this together and put it online and make it usable. So I'm one of the consultants on that. So that's how I got involved in this. So, but particularly with my background in Cherokee history, and I actually gave most of this talk to the people working on the grant a couple of months ago. So I thought it might be, so some of it's pretty basic Cherokee information, but I thought it may be appropriate since we're hearing lots about it on the news in Oklahoma, and there are special programs and all about it, and Luke's done lots of work on it recently. So, but my interest in the race riots permit is to see how many freedmen and their families of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Muskogee nations were impacted. So I looked at the 1920 census for the Greenwood district, and without doing a detailed analysis, it appears that there were only about 10 to 15% of the residents were freedmen. And I did that primarily by going through and looking at their birthplace, particularly if they were adults. For example, here's Emmanuel Clay, who's 40 years old, who's born in Oklahoma. So it's 1920, so he was born around 1880, but both of his parents were also born in Oklahoma. So therefore he likely was a Cherokee freedman, or was a freedman, I should say, but the Clays were Cherokee freedmen, you know that. But going down, here's Rachel Wycliffe, which I'll talk about later, but she was born in Oklahoma and so were her parents. Like I said, there there were not that many, which is sort of surprising, but that there were so many blacks that had moved in from other parts of the country. Looks at here's the one family. It's a Rachel again, born in Oklahoma. And then in that same family is Mary Hogg, who's the mother-in-law. So this is Rachel's mother. And she's 48, so that means she was born around 72. Well, she was born in Oklahoma. Both her parents were born in Oklahoma. So, and in this case, they were Cherokee freedmen. So at first, I'd like to give you a background of slavery in the Indian nations, and particularly the Cherokee Nation. Because Cherokees took captives in wars with other tribes, even before the white men came. And generally, these were killed in retaliation for those Cherokees who'd been killed in the battle. Since the Cherokees operated under clan law, each person belonged to the clan of their mother, the 7 clans. If a Cherokee was killed by another Cherokee, even by accident, then someone from the killer's clan must be killed to keep balance within the clans. While it was generally the person who did the killing, it could be someone close to him, such as brother, but it always had to be someone from his clan. Since the other tribe had killed Cherokee warriors in battle, then the captives must be put to death to keep things in balance. Sometimes, however, the captive was made a slave by the captor. And while the person was a slave for a while and sometimes for life, many times they were eventually adopted by a clan and thus became Cherokee citizens. Early in the 18th century, white traders began living in the various Cherokee towns. And many of them took Cherokee wives, even though they may have had a white wife back in the white settlements or towns. Of course, their children by the Indian wife were Cherokee since they belonged to the clan of their mother. These traders introduced black slaves into the Cherokee Nation. And many of the slaves had come directly from Africa. And there are accounts of several slaves in the early 19th century in the Cherokee Nation who reported as being from Africa, particularly in the Moravian records and Joseph Van's, or James Van and then Joseph Van's slaves. So the Cherokees then began to take the same attitude towards slaves as the white traders and other white plantation owners. There is, however, an interesting court case in the Cherokee Supreme Court in the 1830s. In the latter part of the 18th century, a white trader named Sam Dent married a Cherokee woman of the Deer Clan. He beat her to death. And knowing that he would be put to death under the clan law, he escaped back to the white settlements. There he purchased an African-American slave named Molly, which he brought back into the Cherokee Nation and offered her to the Deer Clan as a replacement for his wife whom he had killed. The Deer Clan accepted her, and thus she became a member of the Deer Clan. Then in the early 1830s, a white woman came to the Cherokee Nation and claimed Molly and her sons, Isaac and Edward Tucker, as her property. She claimed that Sam Dent had sold Molly to her father and that she was entitled to Molly and her issue as her slaves. So the Cherokee Supreme Court refused to recognize her claim. They stated that Molly had been adopted into the Deer Clan, and therefore she and her children were Cherokee citizens. And there are many Cherokee citizens to this day that are descended from Molly. And there was no hesitation on the part of the Supreme Court to recognize the citizenship of Molly, in spite of a Cherokee law being passed earlier, which stated, this was done at Newtown, which is New Eshota, on November 11th, 1824. And it says, resolved by the National Committee and Council that intermarriages between Negro slaves and Indians or whites shall not be lawful. And any person or persons permitting and approbating his, her, or their Negro slaves to intermarry with Indians or whites, he, she, or they so offending shall pay a fine of $50, one half of the benefit of the Cherokee Nation. And be it further resolved that any male, Indian or white man marrying a Negro woman slave he or they shall be punished with 59 stripes on the bare back. Any Indian or white woman marrying a Negro man slave shall be punished with 25 stripes on her or their back. And that was signed by John Ross, who was president of the National Committee, and approved by Pat Keller, who was the principal chief. And at this time, the majority of the Cherokees lived in the Southeast, although a few Cherokees had begun to immigrate west of the Mississippi River in the late 18th century. Several others immigrated during the early 19th century. By 1835, there were approximately 3,000 Cherokees lived west of the Mississippi. And a census was taken of those Cherokees in the East, which showed there were 16,542 Cherokees, 1,592 slaves, 201 white intermarriages. So just under 9% of the population were slaves. So great pressure was being put on the Cherokee Nation for the ceding of all their lands in the East, their removal to the west of Mississippi. The white people wanted the farms and plantations of the Cherokees. And a handful of Cherokees had no authority to do so, signed a treaty in late December of 1835, ceding all the Cherokee lands in the East. And this fraudulent treaty was approved by the U.S. Senate and signed by President Jackson on May 23, 1836. This treaty resulted in the forced removal of the Cherokees to the west, what became known as the Trail of Tears, and the slaves were removed with them. So the Cherokees rebuilt their nation and prospered on their new lands until the Civil War. And at this time, when all federal troops were removed from Indian Territory in 1861, the Chickasaws, Choctaws, and a portion of the Muskogee Nation signed treaties with the Confederacy. The Cherokees attempted to remain neutral with no support from the federal government. They were eventually forced to sign a treaty with the Confederacy. However, when federal troops returned to Indian Territory in 1862, our principal chief, John Ross, with most of his followers, welcomed them. And time will not allow to go into detail about the Civil War in Indian Territory, but suffice it to say that the majority of the Cherokees then joined the Indian Home Guards and fought with the federal troops. The Cherokee Tribal Council approved an Emancipation Proclamation in February of 1863, freeing all slaves within the nation, to become effective on the 25th of June, 1863. And this was well before the legal abolition of slavery by the U.S. with the ratification of the 13th Amendment on the 6th of December, 1865. So most of the Cherokee families, siding with the North, refugeed in Kansas in 1862 and 63. And following the Cherokee Emancipation Proclamation, many, if not most of the slaves also refugeed in Kansas. Some, however, had been taken south by their owners before this time into the Choctaw Nation and even into Texas. And each of the 5 civilized tribes were forced to sign a new treaty with the U.S. in 1866. All of these treaties, with the exception of the Chickasaw, provided that the former slaves of each of these nations were to be granted citizenship of those tribes. The Cherokee Treaty was proclaimed on August 11, 1866, and it provided that any former slaves must return to the Cherokee Nation within 6 months from that date in order to be eligible for citizenship. And this date of February 11, 1867 became very important in establishing citizenship. They frequently had to prove that they were back in the nation, even when the final rolls of the Dawes Commission for the allotment of land were made in the early 1900s. So this brings us back to the 1920 U.S. Census for Greenwood District to look at one of the freedmen families of the Cherokee Nation. This is the one I showed earlier, Lewis Wycliffe with his wife, Rachel, whose mother was, at this time, was the Mary Hogg. And note that, which I mentioned earlier, that Rachel was born in Oklahoma as well as her parents. And Mary Hogg the same, her mother, as well as Mary's brother, Andrew Weber. This is a brother-in-law, born in Oklahoma, both parents born in Oklahoma. So using this information, I was able to locate them on the Cherokee Freedmen roll. And here is the census card for Mary Weber. So Mary A. Weber, see, there's her daughter, Rachel, who's 6 years old, and the son, Andy, who's 5. And then her daughter, Katie, 7 months. And then it shows here, number 1, married in March 1908 to Marilyn Hogg, a non-citizen. Evidence of marriage filed. So that's how she's listed on the 1920 census as Mary Hogg. And it also shows that they're on the Wallace roll, which is a roll of Cherokee freedmen. And this shows, this is the first page. The second page, Mary, of course, is the first one, Rachel's the second one there. It shows that her father's Andy Weber, and he was enrolled, this is in Delaware District, and that's on the Wallace roll of the 1890s. But it shows that his father's owner, Andy's Weber's father, was Robert Weber, and the mother was Rachel Lasley, who was owned by Johnson Whitmire. So then here's the father, Mary's father, Andrew Weber, who's listed as 50, and he's living in Wallace Road there in Saline District. It says he's the slave of Robin Weber. And of course, his daughter said it was Robert Weber. And the name of the father is Robin Weber, who is Cherokee by blood. And then the mother is Cindy Weber, who's a freedman. Then there's the Dawes testimony for Mary A. Weber, and there's 86 pages of testimony. And most of it deals with when her family returned from Kansas. The initial part, of course, is just what is your name, Mary Ann Weber, her age is 26, post office address Chelsea, Cooey District. It says, do you apply to be enrolled as Cherokee freedman? It says, yes, sir. Who do you desire to have enrolled beside yourself? 3 children. And is your name on the roll of 1880? It says, no, sir. Are you married? No. Father's name is Andy. Mother's name, Rachel Whitmire. And is your father living? Yes. The mother is no. And then it goes on that, like I said, there's 86 pages, and some testimony is listed in several different census cards, or I mean, in Dawes' testimony, it's transferred or copied from one to the other. And this was kind of interesting in her packet. His testimony of C.B. Rogers. And he says, tell them your name is C.B. Rogers, age 63 years old, place of residence Claremore. So are you a citizen of the Cherokee Nation? Yes, sir. And how long have you been such? All my life, a little over 63 years. Did you go out of the country during the war? Yes, sir. When did you return? In 66. Where did you come to? I came to Fort Gibson and stayed there, did you? Yes, sir. Well, what was your business? He says, after I came back, yes. He says, I followed freighting for something over 3 years. We're in between what places? Sedalia, which is in Kansas, and Pleasant Hill in Kansas City to Fort Gibson. Were you ever acquainted with a freedman by the name of Mose Whitmire? Yes, I know him. Where did he belong before the war? He belonged in Goingsnake District. Do you know what particular Whitmire he belonged? He says, I don't remember whether he belonged to George Whitmire or Lee, which was the Johnson Lee Whitmire. If you did see him, when did you first see Mose Whitmire after the war, after he returned to the Cherokee Nation? As well as I remember, it was in February of 68. I met them just on this side of the Neosho River as they was moving back to this country from Kansas. There was between 24 and from 24 to 26 wagons, and I met them right on this side of the Neosho River. Dick Whitmire, Mose Whitmire, and Aaron Whitmire, and Old Major Wright is all I knew in the outfit. Did you have any conversation with them? Stop and talk with them? Yes, sir. And Colonel Bill Ross passed while I was talking to them going to Fort Scott. Did you ask them where they were going to? They said they was moving back. Well, this was 25 or more wagons loaded with people. Yes, most everyone had household goods in them. A colony of Cherokee freedmen, yes, coming back to the Cherokee Nation. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is C.V. Clement Van Rogers, who's the father of Will Rogers. Of course, he also grew up in Goingsnake District, just northwest, less than a mile from Baptist Mission, north of Westville. And his family had owned 10 slaves prior to the Civil War, his mother. So, but it's interesting because here we see what Clement Van Rogers was doing immediately after he came back. And this was during the time that he was establishing his ranch near Claremore, that he was also in the freighting business. So a little bit of information on the Rogers family, which is in the Dawes testimony for the freedmen. And then on the 1860 slave schedules, there are 259 slaves in Goingsnake District and 280 slaves in Flint District. And I've often wondered why there were almost no freedmen living in Goingsnake and Flint District following the Civil War. So in this same file of Dawes' testimony, Bluford Alberti, who had given testimony in the case of Aaron Whitmire, but the testimony was also included in Mary Weber's file. This is Bluford Alberti, who of course is from Goingsnake District near Westville. This is George Whitmire before the war lived in Goingsnake District, and this district borders on the line of the state of Arkansas. The claimant now resides near the claimant is Aaron Whitmire, the freedman, now resides near the western line of the Cherokee Nation. The settlement before the war was sparse, where claimant now resides, which is out in the Cooey district, because pretty much all the Cooey district was settled after the Civil War. So there was virtually no one there immediately after. So then it goes on to say, I would say the distance from where George Whitmire resided prior to the war and claimant's present residence is 90 or 100 miles. Witness states that he had a conversation with Sam Weber, which Weber assigned as a reason for settling where he had was that Agent Jones, this is John Buttrick Jones, son of Evan Jones, advised the colored people after their freedom to settle in colonies, or as thickly as it was convenient to do, in an unoccupied part of the country. So the Cooey district would have been considered an unoccupied part. This was thought best for the colored man, as they could have their own schools, etc., until matters were more regulated in the country. And the first conversation was in the fall 1866. The second conversation was in the spring of 67. Said, I saw several of their families in May 1867 or Big Creek or Lightning Creek in the nation. And the home of the claimant is the same locality as that at the time mentioned above. He says, in October, November 1866, I gave claimant and other colored men permission to occupy 2 old fields in that neighborhood for the purpose of raising crops the year following. So this is fall of 66, and remember they had to be returned to the nation by February of 67. So he said, Lewis Whitmire is the name of the other man. I also permitted to go in the old field. The spring of 67, I saw Aaron and Lewis Whitmire at work on the 2 fields spoken of. And the settlement of colored folks has the character of quiet, industrious, and law-abiding citizens, or much as any in the nation. Some of these people have large and good farms, all made by themselves since the war. Now, Lightning Creek is on the east side of the Verdigris River and runs into the Verdigris southeast of present Nowata. So that explains why they settled there rather than coming back to the Goingsnake district, is that Agent Jones told them. Now, this is information I had never seen before until I saw it in this Dawes testimony. So there's an amazing amount of material in the Dawes testimony for the freedmen, particularly in relation to their owners, that you don't see elsewhere. But these testimonies also gives information about other members of the family. And these can be used to piece together her entire family, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. In addition, their location on the earlier rolls are identified. Well, here's the Dawes testimony for Andrew Weber, who's Rachel's father. He says, "What is your name?" "Andrew Weber." "How old are you?" "I don't know my age." He said, "Have you any idea?" I said, "No, sir. It's on the Clifton Road. It's 43, I believe." "What's your post office address?" "Shodo." "In what district?" "It's Saline." "You applying for Rose Cherokee Freedman?" "Yes." "Who did you belong to?" He says, "Robin Weber." "Was he Cherokee?" "Yes." "You applied for anyone besides yourselves?" "No." "What was your father's name?" "Robin Weber, the man that owned me." "Is he living or dead?" "He's dead." "How long has he been dead?" "A long time. I don't know just how long." "What is your mother's name?" Now, since started Cindy, here it says Sunday. "Is she living or dead?" "She's dead." "Was she Cherokee Freedman?" "Yes." "Did she belong to Robin Weber?" "Yes." "And where were you born?" "In the Cherokee Nation on Caney." Now, this is on Caney Creek, which of course begins, headwaters of Caney Creek is near Stillwell, at the Widow Weber's plantation there, which is, they're close to the cemetery. "How long have you been here?" "All the time." "Did you leave the Cherokee Nation after the outbreak of the war?" "Yes." "Would you go to Kansas?" "How long did you stay there?" "Several years." "When did you get there?" "Just before peace was made." "When did you come back?" "I came back in 66. "How do you know it was in 66? And he says, "I know we had to come back on a certain time or we wouldn't have no right." So they knew when they had to be back in the nation. Here is the Wallace roll, which shows Marianne Weber. At that time, she's 18. It was just before her children were born, an alias Mary E. Weber. So the 1860 slave schedules for Johnson Whitmire shows he has 21 slaves. His brother George had 25 slaves. And this is in Goingsnake District. And then there's the 1860 slave schedule for Robert Weber, which is in Flint District. So these are all in the 1860 U.S. Census, and it's listed as Indian lands west of Arkansas. And the 5 tribes has all of the white people living in the 5 tribes enumerated on this census. And then it also has the slave schedules, which has all the slave owners, most of whom are Indian and some are white. So we saw where right here, just south of Barron on Peavine Creek, is right here is the Johnson Whitmire plantation. His brother George Whitmire's plantation was there. We had other large plantation slave owners, particularly the Wright family, which is farther up Barron Fort Creek, near present Wright's Chapel. And of course, the widow Weber lived, as I said, near where the current Stillwell City Cemetery is, but she sold her place right after the Cherokees arrived in 1839 to Walter Scott Adair, but evidently Walter Weber's son, Robert Weber, still kept a plantation, and some of the testimony it shows that it was the old sawmill place. And this is all of Caney Creek, which is the border between Goingsnake and Flint at this point. So it would have been right in this area. It's the Robert Weber's plantation. And about 5 or 6 miles distance is the Johnson Whitmire. Now, the Johnson and George W. Whitmire were the sons of Charlotte Downing and Stephen Whitmire, and both died when their sons were in their youth, and John Downing, Charlotte's brother, became their guardian. And Charlotte was Cherokee and Stephen was white. Then they actually came out as old settlers. And this is Immigration West of Johnson and George Whitmire. This is a letter from the Superintendent of Cherokee Immigration, Benjamin Curry, to the Secretary of War. And he wrote it from the Cherokee Agency, March 22nd, 1832. They were living in Georgia, and the agency was that north of Chattanooga, north of Cleveland, present Charleston on the Wassee River. But Benjamin Curry says, in bringing the family of John Downing with the heirs of Charlotte Downing and their Negro property to this place, it was considered necessary to have a guard, and through the petition of General Coffee, a detachment of the Georgia Guards was directed to accompany us to this point. So they brought them from Georgia to the Cherokee Agency. So this is 32. And then in George Downing's will, which is filed in Hall County, Georgia in 1818, it's George Downing, a half-breed Cherokee, leaves his daughter Charlotte Downing 32 slaves. And George Downing was the son of a British trader, John Downing, and his Cherokee wife. Because remember what I said earlier, that African-American slaves were introduced in the Cherokee Nation by the traders who lived among them. So interestingly, the Charleston Gazette in South Carolina reported in April of 1760 the killing of John Downing by the Cherokees. The Cherokees were at war with the British at this time and sought to kill all white men living within their nation. When John Downing was captured, his half-breed son George was with him. And John had his hands and feet cut off and was burned at the stake. And John's Cherokee wife and her 3 sons and daughters continued to operate the trading post and prospered. By the way, I'm descended from George Downing's brother, John Downing's brother, William. So that's a little bit of what could be found on one freedman family that was involved in the race riot in Tulsa, who were Cherokee freedmen. But one thing I wanted to point out is all the information that can be found in this freedman testimony and what can be learned there. So, do we have any questions or discussion?
I don't have any questions, but I just want to say that that was very interesting, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, me too, Jack. That's just a whole lot to process. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
On the document, the Dawes testimony of George Whitmire, Bluford Alberti's name was up near the top. Was he the judge that was hearing this testimony, or?
He was giving the testimony.
He was giving the testimony?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Can I make some observations here?
Yes.
Okay, first I want to echo what Jack says about finding information about Cherokee in the Freedman testimony. And when you're looking at the Freedman testimony, there's a substantial amount of the ones who were actually enrolled by Dawes, but there's a huge amount of rejected freedmen also, because they could not prove that their families came back prior to the February 1867 date. And of course, generally you would assume that the testimony in those rejected freedmen cards also was correct regarding what they said about their Cherokee owners and things. And also there would be testimony in them by various Cherokees. And you'll notice in lots of cases, and in the one Jack presented, there was some here between the Bluford Alberty and the Clement Rogers. There was some discrepancies about when these people came back. Now, when the freedmen are giving their testimony, they all had no problem saying they got back by the February 1867 date. But there's lots of Cherokees who are contradicting them. I don't think necessarily it was antagonistic against them. They just, and it would be hard to remember 35 years later when exactly something may have occurred. Also, I want to mention about the 1860 census. You see, of course, I have been wondering here for several years now exactly why the U.S. government took a census in 1860 in the Cherokee Nation and the other four tribes. They enumerated all the white people or free black people who were living in those nations at the time. And they also then enumerated the slaves onto slave schedules like they did for the other citizens of the U.S. And you'll notice they, of course, give no names for the slaves, just like they didn't on the regular federal census. But if you can find time, I'd like to find somebody who could do that, find time to take the Dawes testimony for the people who were living in 1860. You could fill out a lot of names of those slaves on the 1860 census from the Dawes testimony that you see that were given by the freedmen. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Jack?
Yeah, excuse me. And I was going to point out on the Robert Weber slave schedule, the likely person who the Andrew Weber was. There are a couple of male blacks, although he didn't know his exact age. There were two male black children that I think one was 4 and maybe one was 8, that one of those likely would have been the Weber. Excuse me, go ahead.
That 1870 census that you did,
Yes.
on there they list people who are Cherokee citizens and who aren't Cherokee citizens, which was really helpful to me because I found out a lot of the Merle slaves who were up in Kansas came back, but they didn't get back in time, and they say right on there that they're not Cherokee citizens. And later on, when they're trying to prove citizenship at allotment, they're saying, well, I think we came back and such, but right on that 1870 census, they're listed on there as non-citizens.
Yes. Yeah, the roll she's talking about was one I think we had published. We also did the slave schedules in the Goingsnake Messenger early on, in 1860. And also several years ago, it did this 1870 census, which is in the letters of the Cherokee letters.
Letters received by the Office of Indian Affairs.
Yes. Thanks, Mary Bell. So that's in there, and it's actually sort of a census of the Cherokee Nation, listing heads of family. It has a lot of good information on it. So, like I said, working on this, I found the two items, the Clement Van Rogers and what he was doing while he was building up his ranch there. He's working as a freighter. And then the other item is the reason they settled out in the Cooey district rather than coming back to the Flint and Goingsnake districts.
I found that really interesting. I hadn't known that either, and I found out a lot of the former slaves of Merle's were up in the Veneta area, and that's probably why.
Yes, because John B. Jones, the agent,
Yeah.
advised him to settle in that area. So, okay. Do we have anything else to discuss? Troy, do you want to give an update on the conference and how Trail of Tears conference and how it's shaping up?
Well, the North Carolina chapter has taken charge of that, and they have they've got a really nice conference lined out. They got a lot of funding from the Cherokee Preservation Foundation to do that with, and so this shaping up to be a really good conference. Let me see if I can tell you speakers. Well, I've got it right here. Y'all bear with me a minute, and I'll grab the folder that's got all the schedule in it and tell you just a little bit. The Charlie Road Armor will do something about the 200th anniversary of the syllabary. Dr. Riggs will do the keynote address on Monday evening at the local high school, to which the local public's invited. Other speakers, Claudio Sant will be the featured speaker on Wednesday, which is the day for all the presentations. And we had him a year or two ago. Jack can tell you more about his research, but he's done not just us, but all the tribes. Dale Stewart's talking. They've got an most of the day field trip to go to see all the mounds. There's a series of mounds out there. They've got buses lined up, a 30-page booklet for the attendees to see while we make that tour, and they'll feed us along the way at different places. The other people that I don't know, I don't have confirmation, but I think I know they're coming. Lindsey Robertson from OU, and what's he going to talk about, Jack? Do you recollect?
Probably the early court cases of the Cherokee.
The
McIntosh case. I don't know that for sure, but that's what he normally talks about.
Yeah. So,
and I might add on the mounds where we're taking the tour, the Niquosi Mound at Franklin and the Cowie Mound. These are the ancient mounds, and the Eastern Band have been repurchasing these. They did the Katua Mound about 20 years ago. So gradually the Eastern Band are reclaiming our sacred sites in the East. And I put it very much for that.
I think that Dr. Riggs is going to do a presentation even before we leave on the field trip, and then at each site, he or somebody is going to talk about those. Looks like it's going to be a really good conference.
And the dates again, Troy?
September 20th, Monday, September 20th, when it starts. We'll have a board meeting that morning, and the conference starts at 2 in the afternoon. Chief Sneed will be there, and Chief Hoskin also, I think. And I think one of the things they were looking at doing during that time, the Park Service needs help. They do not know where all of the wayside exhibits along the trail are or what kind of shape they're in. So they've developed an app that people can easily put on their phone. And then when they go to sites, they can get the coordinates and photos and type in reports and help the Park Service figure out what we've got and where it is. So they're asking for volunteers, and it looks like we're going to offer a session so that people who are interested in helping with that in their area or when they're on a trip can go in, be shown how to use it, and participate in that effort.
And Troy, would you give the location of the conference?
At Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort in Cherokee, North Carolina. I probably should also mention that the conference starts on Monday. The Saturday before, there is an event at Manitou Cave in Fort Payne, Alabama, that will celebrate the 200th anniversary of Sequoia Sylibrary, the fact that that place has become a certified site on the Trail of Tears, and it's all held in conjunction with Fort Payne's annual, I don't know what they call it, Frontier Days, their annual historic celebration. All that's going on the Saturday before. Jack and I are supposed to go. Charlie's supposed to come and give a talk. I think I'm going to do a talk in the morning and Charlie in the afternoon while we all take a tour of the cave.
We might add the cave, or you may have been going to mention, Troy, actually has Sequoia Sylibrary written inside, including some writing of T.C. Guest, Sequoia's son.
And in the past, that had been a show cave, a place where people paid admission and came in, but it's not any longer. It's protected better now. And then the next day after that, in Woodbury, Tennessee, the Creek lady, Melba Chakotay Eads, they have an annual commemorative walk right after church, and they walk about a mile of removal route. And so that somehow is scheduled so that some of us can attend. So I'll go from Manitou Cave to that event. And then, so those are pre-conference events. After the conference, there is a Rooted in the Mountains Heritage Day on Saturday, and the Thursday and Friday. Our conference runs Monday, Tuesday, part of Wednesday. On Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, Western Carolina University host a symposium, some kind of a conference with speakers on Thursday and Friday, and then Saturday there is this big festival in Cooey, I think. But it's so all that's going on right after the conference, and sometimes they have an archaeology conference about this time. I don't know if that's going to make or not. So thought everybody ought to know in case somebody wants to stay over and do all of that.
And Anna, you have an event coming up, right, in the fall?
Yes. Yes.
You want to talk about it and the date?
Yeah. So, Jack, is it the 5th? It's the 5th, right? It's going to be on the 5th. It's the 200th anniversary of Salem College, which is in Winston-Salem. And for the Cherokee girls, we have 13 Cherokee girls that attended school there, both before and after removal.
It's the third, it's the 3rd and 4th. Sunday the 3rd and 4th, Monday the 4th.
We're not going to do the 4th. We're not going to do Monday. We're only going to do Sunday. But okay. Yeah, so
that's September or October.
This is October, Shirley. Okay. And so there will be presentations, but there'll also be lots of original documents available for people to see. all the girls' bill books in the library will, so you can see what they bought. And it's very interesting because you be able to see what they studied, what they wore. So it'll be
And but excuse me, but this is the Cherokee girls that attend
Cherokee girls. Yes, yes. The
the
Cherokee
11, right?
Yeah. So that would be Major Ridge's daughter. It would be John Ross's daughter. It would be David McNair's daughters, granddaughters, David McNair's daughters. It's really fascinating. So please come.
And you'll be dedicating a plaque on the,
Yeah, there'll be a bronze marker placed on the college campus. There will be, for any out-of-town guests, there's a reception at my house on Saturday night before, and then there's a Moravian chicken pie dinner after the unveiling. You'll also get to see the gunsmith shop. Timothy Vogler, who was a gunsmith, traveled in the Cherokee Nation, traded with the Cherokee Nation, and the doctor's house, where there's an exhibit on Spring Place, where Anna Rosina and her studies in botany, that's there. So it'll be really fun. You can visit the Moravian Archives. We'll be showing the Trail of Tears movie, which you've all seen, but you know, that'll be great for our community. So please come.
well, it looks like we've finished our business. So so I will entertain a motion to adjourn, but then we can stay on later and visit.
So moved.
Okay. All in favor, say aye, or thumbs up, whatever.
Hi.
Bye.
Any opposed? Okay. We are adjourned.